those carbohydrates. They still have to move around within the plant. So if we don't have any water movement in the plant, those different carbohydrates are kind of just sitting there not doing much. The plant has to actually take in energy to do something with those.
So a lot more holistic approach that you described there, stuff to look out for throughout the cycle. Excellent. Thank you for that. Okay. Looks like Jason has a follow-up. Let's go with that follow-up. They want to know, what planting density do you recommend? We run one plant per 1 square foot, 3 to 4 feet plant height. What do you recommend for maximum production in a 4-liter pot? What I'm really asking is how much substrate volume per. What do you guys think?
So I'm hearing two questions here. One would be about substrate. One would be about plant spacing, if I heard that correctly. If you can get good light intensity, you're saying you're in a greenhouse, so in the summertime, that sounds 1 plant per square foot. It's pretty tight, right? Usually we're talking about having multiple plants per square foot. Looking at the range of 0.6 plants per square foot would be pretty reasonable for something that size, maybe just a little bit tighter than that even. So
yeah, if you can't get enough radiation in there to get that good penetration and allow those plants to spread out a little bit, we see strain dependent a lot of the best results between 9 and 12 plants per 4x4. For reference, that's a great way to think about it. Is all the pictures you see online of people slabs, 3 slabs per light, 9 plants usually gives us pretty good results. And then from there, we're looking at, certain strain dependent. I've seen strains that we can run up at strains that do not branch out very well and or are like a semi-dwarf plant where I do have to pack them in to get that yield. But I'll say it again, 9 to 12 per light is where most strains tend to land in most situations.
All right, you guys, thank you for that. Okay, keeping it moving. We got this in from Presidential. Deficiency would be from iron, calcium, and magnesium.
Possibly. I mean, most of the time when I see tip burn, it's just related to too low of nutrients and or other environmental factors. Unless you're mixing your own or using a non-standard salt that we see on the market.
Yeah, typically if you're seeing that burn, a lot of times it is low nutrient situation and heavy pH swings day to day as the plant's trying to cycle through that low nutrient load. Where if we're running down at a 2, let's say a 2 EC in the substrate, that, number 1 might be on the ragged edge of adequate, or the plant might be taking up almost every good thing that we give it. And at that lower EC state, when the plant is chomping through those salts, it's swinging the pH pretty wildly day to day because there's not enough ionic load in the soil or in the substrate to compensate for that. So most deficiencies we see, just like Jason said, unfortunately, a lot of times the answer is more fertilizer and correct your pH. Once you start pushing these plants with high light, high CO2, controlled heat, now nutrition is one of the weaker legs in our system, right? And we've just got to provide enough. And, just for reference, a lot of times when you're seeing some yellowing, light green on new growth, that's we're looking at a deficiency. That tip burn is oftentimes related to either pH swing, or we definitely see this a lot, people wanting to push an extremely heavy dryback early on, especially in generative. If you want to take your cocoa plants down to like 12% BWC, anytime you hit that point, we're approaching temporary wilting point. And when that happens, the plant's going to drought response mode, which basically means that all the distal parts of the plant, every part that's farthest from the roots, aka your leaf tips, is the first part that's going to suffer because it takes so much energy to get water from the root zone to those marginal edges of the leaf. So that's the first spot you're going to see symptoms of over drying or a pH swing.
And so kind of the diagnostic steps in order would be take a look at your pHs, consider what EC you're feeding at. If you're already feeding at a low EC and you see those pH swings, pretty simple solution there would be increase your ECs, keep monitoring pH, see if that solves it. If you are in check on the other variables, sending in for a leaf tissue analysis is a really easy way to cost effectively and quickly diagnose specifically what elements are either in deficiency or excess.
Yeah, and then going beyond that, you might be looking at some water quality issues or something like that. And then another thing to look at is your incoming water quality. Like, hey, is my feed water temp below 70 degrees Fahrenheit? If the answer is no, I mean, that's another thing we got to check and get in line to make sure we're getting good plant health. When we see symptoms on the plant, it's not always indicative of a particular deficiency unless we can eliminate a bunch of different things along that path. So usually plant nutrition is kind of the last spot. Most commercial fertilizers now are pretty darn adequate. I've grown plenty of, not plenty, but as a tester, I've certainly grown some weed with Miracle-Gro, and I can assure you it worked fine as long as I was keeping up on my parameters. So check everything holistically, and unfortunately, nutrient deficiencies seem like they're always going to be like that silver bullet. Hey, my problem's solved, but usually it's a fair bit more complicated than just switching your nutrient line.
I love that. Y'all are dropping the knowledge today. I love that you mentioned water temperature. We actually got a question that fits right in with that. Somebody submitted over Instagram. How would you make a feed if your well water is coming out at 1.2 EC? Got any advice?
The first thing you got to do is send in for water sample analysis. You have to know what's in that water in order to work with it. If we have some levels of calcium in there, that's some free nutrition. If we've got levels of chlorine or too much iron, then we know that we may need to be investing in an RO system in order to combat that, because we can't get rid of some of the nutrients that are in this solution coming in.
Yeah, I mean, that's your best first step. Get that analysis, because there are other things like bicarbonates and stuff as well that will cause precipitation of nutrients once you mix it, which will make it really difficult to achieve your target EC ratios and specific nutrient concentrations in solution. So get that test. And, if you're a commercial cultivator, I like to get that test and call the nutrient company. They should have an answer on what they recommend you do with their line in spite of this. And unfortunately, a lot of times it's going to be investing in an RO system or some other means of chemical scrubbing, depending on what's in your water. If it's coming out that high, I would definitely be worried about it being a little alkaline and having issues along those lines. Hopefully you get some good news back from the test, but it'll at least give you some insight on which direction to go.
All right, get that well water tested. Excellent. All right, switching gears. Another question from Instagram. Somebody wants to know, do you cut off CO2 and drop light levels by 50% in the last 10 days? What do you guys think?
I wouldn't drop light levels that much. Maybe for the last 5 days, go down 20% or something. But typically, I like to keep my energy and CO2 levels pretty much at full potential until the end of harvest.
Yeah, especially with the shift to LED light, we're not getting a lot of radiation later on, provided the rest of the ambient room temp and leaf surface temps are in line. There's not a lot of reason to try to restrict two of the main things that do contribute to plant development. We already ideally are restricting nitrogen, not applying that as heavily, not pushing plant growth. We want that plant to be as healthy as possible coming into harvest, not declining in terms of overall plant health.
Cool. Thank you guys. Sorry, a lot of questions coming in, so trying to keep track of it. Thanks, y'all, for being patient with us. Trying to get to as many questions as we can. Thank you guys for that. All right, keeping it moving. We got another question regarding larvae buds. Somebody wants to know, would you cut off larvae buds when you're at day 45?
Buy bubble bags.
Go ahead.
Buy bubble bags. Start making hash. At that point, you're throwing away. Past about the day 21, which is where we usually call the end of stretch for most strains, you're just throwing away money that you put into energy to produce that little larvae bud. So when you get a lot of that, sure, if you don't think there's anything you can do with that material, although on the commercial setting, that's called the weed that goes into your joints, goes into hash production, concentrates, etc. So Next time, take notes, take pictures, and really document like, hey, when did we do our first pruning, and how did we do it? Because the other thing I've seen too is a lot of confusion around actual pruning. So if we go with a technique where we're stripping leaves at like day one early in flower, or not touching it till the end of flower, but all you're doing is stripping leaves and not actually removing those lower buds, you're going to end up with a lot of little larvae buds. So being thorough with your strip, and then really tuning your pruning strategies to different strains, because some strains, there's a wedding cake cut I used to grow that I always use as an example, but that thing I would barely clean up the bottom because somehow it had the genetic potential to put out little golf balls down low. It was really good about tightening up those buds. Plenty of other strains I've grown just don't do that. So I know, okay, a few runs in, if I don't do that cleanup hard enough early enough, I'm going to end up with a lot of little buds. And then that does relate back to our plant height discussion. If you're flipping a big plant, you want to work with the plant, not fight it in terms of growth. If you're growing a lot of matter only to chop it off, that's a wasteful process. So now we're looking at, okay, flipping a smaller plant, we're going to get better light penetration and have to do less work on it.
Fantastic. Awesome, you guys. All right. Keeping it moving here. Now, Smokey submitted this question. Thank you again for following up with us, Smokey. We get a lot of questions and can't get to everything, but glad you are on top of it. So I'm going to read all of this, and I think we're going to talk about it. All right. So, hello. I am having some discoloration inside of my flower before and after harvest. I don't notice any mold, but it looks like a very light green color to almost white. The outside of the flower looks great. This is only happening with a couple strains in the room. I have added a ton more airflow to the room to try and correct this problem, but it seems to still be happening. I run in cocoa at 2.5 to 3 EC, CO2 1000, PPFD 900, 1.4 VPD. Any ideas what's happening? And then let me read you the follow-up. This is week 6. Temps are 80 and 50 to 55, humidity most of the time. I don't see any browning on the stems, just this really light color. It's only happening with the large bud plants. So that's the first part of the questions. What do you guys think?
Probably sounds like we have botrytis issues. It's hard to say without actually looking at the buds. Certain genetics are especially susceptible to botrytis. It's an unfortunate reality. One thing, I know Jason's seen this in the past. There's some strains, it's just heartbreaking. You grow these big old baseball bats and then you break them open and you find mold like, a couple days before harvest, or you don't see it at harvest, but by the time you've hung those plants up, in a few days that it takes them to dry down, that bud rot's really hit. One thing to focus on is your nighttime VPD, and then starting to do some dew point calculations to make sure you're not actually hitting any condensation events inside the room. With those bigger buds, what we see is a lot of times people, we want to cool it down, try to push that overnight diff to bring out that purple, but if you're not careful, you can accidentally hit a dew point event. And whether it's condensation coming from the ceiling of your greenhouse or grow room, or those plants actually getting cold enough to have condensation on them, once there's liquid on there, there is no drying out that bigger bud. And if the plant's susceptible, you're probably going to have botrytis. Most of us can't really afford to run a surgically clean room. And if you're, anywhere where agricultural production happens, which is most of the country, except for in pretty urban areas, and even in those, fruit trees, rose bushes, a bunch of the plants that we like to have around us outside are hosts for botrytis. So much like aspergillus, good old bread mold, it is pretty ubiquitous to our environment. So making sure your nighttime VPD is in line, making sure when you cross temperature barriers, you're not accidentally hitting dew point, and then understanding that when you go below 70 degrees Fahrenheit, you're opening up, especially at night, you're opening up opportunity for a lot of pathogens to form because they bloom essentially, in the 50 to 70 degree range, not in 75 to 85, for instance. So that nighttime VPD is really, really important when we're looking at that. And then knowing that some of these diseases are ubiquitous in the environment, or at least their spores are, looking at how we can go about, either saying, hey, this plant's not practical to grow here. I need to, this is where pheno hunting becomes fun. If you're, I used to say we did a lot of mold screening when we did our pheno hunts, but that was something we had to look at. If we popped 20 seeds, that's an evaluation factor here. Like, did any of them not mold? If it didn't mold right there, that's a selection trait for us as a big winner in the greenhouse, because seasonally that's a huge challenge. And then, you know, if you're determined to keep some of those genetics, like many of us are, finding alternative strategies to reduce that bud size. So that's where, you know, we typically talk about not topping, not doing things like that. But this is where, you know, one thing I've had success with in the past is a late topping towards the end of week 2, beginning of week 3. I'll go take off all of my apical buds that I know are going to form my strong, dominant, big nugs. And really just, I know that I'm sacrificing yield, but if I was going to drag a bucket around and throw away a bunch of product anyways in a month and a half, let's just get it out of there and try to reduce the contamination risk.
Yeah, and basically, you know, my approach, hitting everything that Seth would hit here as far as environmental factors and plant stuff. I would also just try and understand, is this uniform across my strains? You know, what is the susceptibility point in this? Is it in a specific area in the room? And then kind of analyze it from there. If it's ubiquitous across all crops and all the room, then it's probably going to be absolutely environmental, or maybe something related to plant health that you can work on. If you do find something that is more isolated, like I said, per strain, then work on that strain. Try and identify some management points. Maybe you need to do a little bit more crop management or canopy management on that specific strain. Maybe we need to get it in a slightly higher airflow area. If we do have striations in airflow, then you did say that you increased your airflow, but is that airflow uniform across the room? So, you know, bringing canopy management into there and isolating the circumstance might also be helpful.
Yeah, one of my favorite things to do if I'm finding mold in a room and I just can't find, you know, why is this, where is this coming from, what's going on, is to try to get in there during a cold event or right after the room starts warming up. But look up. We have a lot of cables strung around these, a lot of conduit in these rooms. Oftentimes we've got things like dehues that are actively pulling water out of the air, so there can be leaks there. There can be condensation inside the unit. We talk about ACs or ducting. That can be a huge issue. I've seen plenty of times where an uninsulated duct will form a lot of condensation on it. And then we extend that to like light fixtures, cables, and all these things that have, they're not designed with a shape that allows water to drip to the sides of the room. So anywhere that cable's dipped, anywhere on that fixture that condensation can drip off, once that hits a bud, that's going to form mold, and that can sometimes look very sporadic across your facility. Make it really hard to figure out what's going on. And since also generally most of us aren't just standing in the room when the lights turn off and turning on a green light and staring at the ceiling looking for drips, it's hard to spot those. I mean, you know, you've got quite a few square feet and it's dark in there. No one's in there. So it's tough to have eyes on some of those dew point events. And that's why it's good to look at just a small dew point calculator, and you can look back and see if it's likely that you have been hitting it or not. And then also looking at, hey, some of these, I don't want to say micro events, but sometimes when your AC kicks on, you're going to have a condensation event just on the ducts, things like that. So really trying to identify, like, is it susceptible? Is it a susceptibility issue? Is it a VPD issue? Or, you know, is it just a machinery issue in the facility and I need to adjust my set points to make sure that I'm not accidentally introducing any liquid moisture into the room that I don't want to?
You guys gave a lot of great advice to Smokey. The other part of their question was, could this be a result of underfed plants or higher VPD swings, or maybe just blowing up the buds too big for the EC that's available? But it sounds like you gave all the different considerations and things that he needs to be taking a look at this point, yeah?
Oh, absolutely. And that's the other thing, you know, when we're talking about IPM and plant health, your first best defense is healthy plants. Deficient plants get sick easier. They can't, you know, they're not as sturdy. They can't resist invasion by fungi. So plant health is always